The story of Black Lives Matter begins long before a hashtag, long before a smartphone camera, long before the phrase itself was ever spoken. It begins in the earliest foundations of the United States, in a society built in part on the forced labor of enslaved Africans, where law, custom, and violence intertwined to define Black life as property rather than personhood. From the 17th century onward, systems of racial hierarchy hardened into institutions, shaping who could vote, who could own land, who could learn to read, and who could move freely. Even after slavery formally ended in 1865, the nation did not abandon racial control. Instead, it reshaped it. In the decades after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people briefly experienced political participation and community building on an unprecedented scale. Black men held office, schools were founded, churches expanded, and families sought to reunite across distances carved by sale and separation. But this moment of possibility was met with fierce resistance. White supremacist groups used terror, intimidation, and lynching to reassert dominance. Southern states passed laws that became known as Jim Crow, codifying segregation in transportation, housing, education, and public life. The promise of equal citizenship, embedded in the Constitution after the war, was hollowed out by poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence that kept Black Americans away from the ballot box. The logic behind these systems was not only social, but deeply political and economic. Cheap labor, racial division among workers, and the myth of Black inferiority helped justify inequality. This structure shaped generations, embedding disparities in wealth, health, and opportunity that would echo far into the future. Resistance never disappeared. Black communities organized through churches, mutual aid societies, newspapers, and legal challenges. The struggle for racial justice was not a sudden eruption in the 20th century, it was a continuous thread. By the early 20th century, a new phase of activism emerged. Organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People pursued legal strategies to dismantle segregation. Black intellectuals and artists of the Harlem Renaissance asserted cultural power, challenging degrading stereotypes. Meanwhile, the Great Migration saw millions of Black Americans leave the rural South for cities in the North and West, seeking jobs and a reprieve from the most overt forms of Southern racial terror. Yet discrimination followed them. Housing segregation, job exclusion, and police brutality were not confined to one region. Policing became a particularly charged site of conflict. In many cities, police forces functioned less as neutral protectors and more as enforcers of racial boundaries. They policed where Black people could live, gather, and protest. Tensions frequently erupted into violence, as seen in race riots from Chicago to Tulsa, where entire Black neighborhoods were attacked and destroyed. These events left deep scars and reinforced distrust between Black communities and law enforcement. The mid-20th century brought what is often called the modern civil rights movement, but for those involved, it was simply the next phase of an ongoing fight. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional, energizing activists. In 1955, the refusal of Rosa Parks to give up her bus seat in Montgomery sparked a mass boycott that lasted over a year. A young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a national figure, articulating a vision of nonviolent resistance grounded in moral appeal and strategic disruption. Sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives, and mass marches challenged segregation across the South. Protesters faced beatings, arrests, and murder. Televised images of violence against peaceful demonstrators shocked many Americans and drew international attention during the Cold War, when the United States was eager to present itself as a beacon of freedom. Legislation followed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to dismantle legal segregation and protect black voting rights. Yet legal change did not erase structural inequality. Northern cities erupted in uprisings during the 1960s, often triggered by incidents of police brutality. The language used to describe these events differed depending on perspective. Some called them riots, others rebellions. For many black residents, they were explosions of frustration after decades of neglect, discrimination, and aggressive policing. Groups such as the Black Panther Party argued that self-defense and community control were necessary responses to state violence, running programs for free breakfast, health clinics, and political education even as they clashed with law enforcement. Over time, public attention shifted, and many Americans embraced a narrative that the major battles of civil rights had been won. But disparities in incarceration, housing, schooling, and wealth persisted. The war on drugs, launched in the late 20th century, dramatically expanded the prison system. Black Americans were arrested and sentenced at disproportionately high rates, even for similar rates of drug use across racial groups. Entire neighborhoods experienced cycles of surveillance, arrest, and imprisonment, fracturing families and economic stability. By the early 21st century, a new generation was coming of age in this landscape. They inherited both the victories of earlier movements and the unfinished business. They also lived in a world transformed by digital technology. Mobile phones with cameras, social media platforms, and online networks allowed ordinary people to document events and share them instantly with a global audience. Incidents that might once have remained local now spread within hours. In 2012, the killing of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager in Florida, became a flashpoint. When the man who shot him was acquitted, grief and anger rippled across the country. In response, 3 black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tomte, helped popularize a phrase that had first appeared in a social media post, "Black Lives Matter." The words were both a declaration and a protest. They responded to a long history in which black life had been treated as expendable, asserting its value in the face of repeated evidence to the contrary. The phrase soon became the banner for a decentralized movement. In 2014, the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson ignited weeks of protest. Residents took to the streets, demanding accountability and transparency. Heavily militarized police responses, including armored vehicles and tear gas, were broadcast across television and social media. The images prompted national debate about the use of force, the militarization of police departments, and the relationship between law enforcement and black communities. What distinguished this moment from earlier eras was not only the grievance, but the speed and scale of communication. Live streams from protest sites, Twitter threads, and viral videos allowed activists to shape the narrative in real time, challenging official accounts. Hashtags functioned as organizing tools, memorials, and rallying cries. They connected local incidents into a national pattern, suggesting that these were not isolated tragedies, but symptoms of systemic problems. Black Lives Matter chapters formed in cities across the United States, each adapting to local conditions while sharing common themes: opposition to police violence, commitment to black dignity, and a broader critique of systems that produce racial inequality. The movement's structure reflected lessons from earlier struggles. Rather than centering a single charismatic leader, it emphasized networked leadership, with many women and LGBTQ activists in prominent roles. This challenged traditional images of civil rights leadership and broadened the movement's focus to include gender, sexuality, immigration status, and disability. Opposition also grew. Some critics argued that focusing on race was divisive, or that the phrase implied that other lives did not matter. Supporters countered that the point was not exclusion, but correction, drawing attention to a group whose lives had historically been undervalued by institutions. Political leaders debated reforms such as body cameras for police officers, changes to use-of-force policies, and efforts to reduce mass incarceration. At the same time, polarization intensified, with some framing the movement as anti-police rather than anti-police brutality. The pattern of protest and viral visibility continued. Names became widely known. Eric Garner, whose repeated words, "I can't breathe," after being placed in a chokehold, were captured on video. Sandra Bland, found dead in a jail cell after a traffic stop. Freddie Gray, who died after sustaining spinal injuries in police custody. Each case added to a growing archive of evidence that shaped public consciousness. Social media did more than spread information. It altered how history itself was recorded. In earlier decades, documentation of abuse often depended on professional journalists or official investigations. Now bystanders could become witnesses whose footage might spark national outrage. Digital archives preserved posts, images, and testimonies that future historians would analyze as primary sources. The boundary between participant and chronicler blurred. By the late 2010s, Black Lives Matter had influenced elections, corporate policies, university debates, and cultural production. Murals appeared on city streets, books and films explored themes of systemic racism, and professional sports leagues saw athletes kneel or speak out. The movement had become both a grassroots network and a symbol invoked in many contexts, sometimes embraced, sometimes contested. Then, in May 2020, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, recorded in a bystander's video showing a police officer kneeling on his neck for over 9 minutes, triggered one of the largest waves of protest in U.S. history. Demonstrations spread to all 50 states and to cities around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic formed the backdrop, highlighting disparities in health and economic vulnerability that disproportionately affected Black communities. The sense of crisis was layered: a public health emergency, economic disruption, and a reckoning with racial injustice. Crowds filled streets demanding change. Statues of Confederate leaders were removed. Corporations issued statements supporting racial equity. Legislators proposed reforms. Yet disagreements persisted about the scope of change needed, from incremental policy adjustments to more radical rethinking of public safety and investment in social services. The phrase, "defund the police," entered mainstream debate, interpreted in different ways by different advocates. Throughout these developments, the role of technology remained central. Algorithms amplified some voices and suppressed others. Online spaces became arenas for education, misinformation, solidarity, and harassment. Digital activism lowered barriers to entry, but also raised questions about sustainability, surveillance, and the commercialization of dissent. Activists had to navigate not only streets and courtrooms, but platforms governed by private companies with their own rules and incentives. The long struggle for racial justice, seen through the lens of Black Lives Matter, reveals both continuity and change. The core demand that Black people be treated as fully human, entitled to safety, opportunity, and respect, echoes across centuries. What shifts are the strategies, tools, and political contexts. Each generation inherits the unfinished work of the last, shaped by memories of past victories and traumas. The movement is not a single moment, but part of a living history, unfolding in real time, where the recording of events, the interpretation of meaning, and the fight for change are deeply intertwined. And where the question of whose lives are valued remains a measure of the nation's commitment to its own ideals. The scale of the 2020 protests forced a broad public confrontation with ideas that had long circulated in academic, activist, and community spaces, but rarely dominated national conversation. Terms such as systemic racism, structural inequality, and implicit bias moved from specialized discussions into everyday speech. For many people, The video of George Floyd's death functioned as a moral shock, a moment that made abstract statistics about police violence feel immediate and undeniable. For others, it reinforced long-held understandings shaped by personal or community experience. The divergence in reactions revealed how differently Americans experienced the same institutions depending on race, class, and geography. One of the key connections between earlier civil rights struggles and the Black Lives Matter era lies in the question of state power and accountability. During the 1960s, activists faced local police forces, state troopers, and federal agencies that surveilled, infiltrated, and sometimes sought to disrupt movements. In the 21st century, those dynamics persisted but were layered with new technologies. Facial recognition, data tracking, and online monitoring raised concerns that digital tools empowering activists could also be used against them. The same platforms that spread protest calls could be mined for intelligence. This dual nature of technology echoed a broader theme in the history of racial justice. Tools of liberation and tools of control often develop side by side. The legal system remained a central arena. High-profile prosecutions of police officers were historically rare, contributing to a perception that law enforcement operated with impunity. In some cases, during the 2010s and early 2020s, charges were brought and convictions secured, outcomes that earlier generations of activists might have considered nearly impossible. Yet these individual cases did not automatically transform broader patterns. Debates continued over qualified immunity, police union contracts, and the standards governing use of force. Reformers argued that without structural changes, training, oversight, community investment, and alternative responses to mental health crises, cycles of violence would continue. Another crucial thread involved memory and narrative. Monuments, school curricula, and public commemorations became battlegrounds over how the past should be understood. Campaigns to remove statues honoring Confederate leaders or figures linked to slavery and segregation were not only about stone and bronze, they were about whose history is honored and whose suffering is acknowledged. Critics saw such removals as erasing history, while supporters argued they were challenging selective memory that glorified oppression. This struggle over historical interpretation connected directly to the documentary nature of the present moment, where videos, posts, and digital archives were already shaping how future generations would understand this era. The global dimension of the movement also stood out. Protests in London, Paris, Sydney, and other cities linked local issues, such as colonial legacies and discrimination against minority groups, to the symbolism of Black Lives Matter. The phrase became a transnational language of dissent, even as specific histories differed. This echoed earlier periods when anti-colonial movements and U.S. civil rights struggles influenced each other, reminding observers that racial hierarchies have long operated on a global scale, tied to empire, migration, and economic systems. Within the United States, the movement influenced electoral politics. Candidates at local, state, and national levels addressed policing, criminal justice reform, and racial equity in new ways. District attorneys in several cities ran on platforms promising to reduce incarceration and hold police accountable. School boards debated the presence of police officers on campuses. City councils considered budgets not just as financial documents, but as moral statements about priorities. The phrase Black Lives Matter appeared on campaign materials, murals outside government buildings, and corporate marketing campaigns, signaling both mainstream recognition and the risk of dilution as institutions adopted the language without always embracing deeper changes. The role of art and culture provided another bridge between past and present. Music, literature, film, and visual art have always been part of Black political expression, from spirituals and blues to hip-hop and spoken word. In the Black Lives Matter era, Artists responded to police violence and protest with works that circulated widely online. Murals bearing the names and faces of victims turned city walls into memorials. Documentaries, novels, and television series explored themes of racial injustice, reaching audiences who might not attend a protest but could engage emotionally through story. Culture did not simply reflect politics, it shaped how people felt about it. Generational dynamics added further complexity. Older activists sometimes emphasized continuity with the civil rights era, drawing on lessons about coalition building, nonviolent strategy, and legislative advocacy. Younger organizers, many of whom had grown up with the internet, often favored horizontal networks, rapid mobilization, and an intersectional framework that foregrounded overlapping forms of oppression. Tensions arose, but also productive exchanges, as experience met new energy. The movement's decentralized nature made it adaptable, but also harder to define in a single voice. At the community level, mutual aid became a visible component, especially during the pandemic. Groups organized food distribution, rent support, and health information, linking racial justice to material survival. This echoed earlier traditions in Black communities, where churches, fraternal organizations, and neighborhood associations provided support in the face of exclusion from mainstream institutions. The idea that protest must be paired with care for daily needs reinforced a broader vision of justice that extended beyond policing to housing, healthcare, education, and employment. Opposition to the movement did not only come from individuals, but was embedded in political structures. Some states passed laws increasing penalties for protest-related offenses or limiting the ability of municipalities to reduce police funding. Media ecosystems amplified narratives portraying protests as primarily violent, even when most demonstrations were peaceful. Disinformation circulated online, sometimes deliberately, complicating efforts to maintain trust and clarity. These dynamics underscored that the struggle over racial justice is also a struggle over information, framing, and power. As years passed, a familiar historical pattern emerged, moments of intense visibility followed by periods of quieter organizing. The headlines faded, but local groups continued working on policy changes, community programs, and education. This rhythm mirrored earlier movements, where landmark moments like the March on Washington or Selma voting rights marches were supported by years of less visible groundwork. The danger of equating a movement solely with its most dramatic images is that it obscures the sustained labor required for lasting change. Black Lives Matter, in this sense, functions both as a specific organization network and as a broader moral claim. It insists on reckoning with the historical accumulation of disadvantage produced by slavery, segregation, discriminatory policies, and unequal enforcement of law. It also challenges individuals and institutions to examine how assumptions about race shape decisions in hiring, lending, healthcare, and media representation. The conversation moves from the street to the boardroom, from the courtroom to the classroom. The story remains unfinished. Each new incident, policy debate, or cultural shift becomes another chapter in a long narrative stretching back centuries. The technologies may change, the slogans may evolve, and the political landscape may shift, but the underlying questions persist. Who is protected by the state, and who is treated as a threat? Whose suffering is seen, and whose is ignored? How does a nation reconcile its stated ideals with its lived realities? As long as these questions remain open, the movement for racial justice continues, shaped by memory, propelled by new generations, and recorded in real time by the very tools that connect the world. To understand how this movement fits into the longer arc of American history, it helps to look closely at how ideas about race have been constructed and reconstructed over time. Race is not a fixed biological reality, but a social category that has been defined differently in different eras to serve economic and political ends. In the colonial period, laws gradually hardened distinctions between Europeans and Africans, ensuring that enslavement would follow the status of the mother and that conversion to Christianity would not grant freedom. These legal choices created a hereditary system of bondage tied to skin color, laying a foundation that would shape the nation's development. After emancipation, new systems replaced old ones. Sharecropping bound many black families to land they did not own, trapped in cycles of debt. Convict leasing allowed states to arrest black men on minor or fabricated charges and lease their labor to private companies, a practice that historian Douglas Blackman once described as slavery by another name. These arrangements were enforced through law and violence, blurring the line between criminal justice and labor control. The association of blackness with criminality, reinforced through policy and popular culture, would later influence policing and sentencing patterns. In the 20th century, federal policies that were not explicitly about race nonetheless had racialized effects. Redlining, a practice in which banks and government agencies marked minority neighborhoods as risky for loans, limited black homeownership and wealth accumulation. Suburban development, subsidized by federal mortgages, often excluded black buyers through covenants and discrimination. Since home equity became a primary source of intergenerational wealth for many white families, these policies widened a gap that persists. When activists in the Black Lives Matter era speak about systemic racism, they are pointing to this web of policies and practices that, taken together, produce unequal outcomes even without overtly racist language. Education followed similar patterns. Segregation did not end with Brown v. Board of Education. It often shifted from legal mandate to residential patterns shaped by earlier discrimination. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods frequently had fewer resources, larger class sizes, and less experienced teachers. This influenced job opportunities, income, and health over lifetimes. Thus, when protests call for investment in communities, they reflect an understanding that policing is only one piece of a larger system affecting life chances. Media representation also evolved. In earlier eras, mainstream news often depicted black protest as disorderly or dangerous, while ignoring underlying grievances. With the rise of social media, communities could present their own narratives, but they also had to contend with new forms of distortion. Short clips could go viral without context, and algorithms could reward outrage over nuance. Activists became not only organizers, but communicators, learning to frame messages in ways that could travel quickly while retaining depth. The emotional dimension of the movement deserves attention as well. Grief, anger, exhaustion, and hope intertwine. For families who have lost loved ones to police violence, activism can be a way to transform personal tragedy into collective purpose. Public vigils, marches, and murals create spaces for mourning that are also political statements. These rituals echo earlier traditions, from church gatherings during the civil rights era to the singing of spirituals that carried both sorrow and resilience. Alliances have been another important feature. Black Lives Matter has intersected with movements for immigrant rights, indigenous sovereignty, disability justice, and LGBTQ equality. The concept of intersectionality, developed by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw, highlights how different forms of oppression overlap. This framework helps explain why many organizers emphasize that the struggle is not only about race in isolation, but about how race interacts with gender, sexuality, class, and ability. Such an approach broadens the movement's base, but also adds complexity, as different priorities must be negotiated. Religious institutions, long central in black communities, continue to play roles, though the landscape is more varied than in the mid-20th century. Churches host meetings and provide moral language, while secular organizations and online communities offer additional spaces for connection. The moral vocabulary of the movement draws from multiple traditions, the language of human rights, constitutional principles, and spiritual beliefs about dignity and justice. International observers often view the movement as a test of American democracy. The United States has long projected an image of freedom and equality, yet its history of racial oppression complicates that narrative. When protests erupt, they reveal both the persistence of injustice and the vitality of civic engagement. The ability of people to gather, speak, and demand change is itself a democratic act, even as conflicts over policing and protest rights expose tensions within the system. Economic factors cannot be separated from these dynamics. Deindustrialization in many cities reduced job opportunities, while cuts to social services left gaps often filled by policing rather than support. When mental health crises, homelessness, or substance use are addressed primarily through law enforcement, the likelihood of violent encounters can increase. Advocates for reform argue that reallocating resources toward healthcare, education, and housing could reduce the need for police intervention in the first place. As the movement matures, questions of strategy continue to evolve. Some activists focus on local policy wins, such as civilian oversight boards or changes to traffic enforcement practices. Others aim for broader transformations in how safety and justice are conceptualized. Scholars and organizers debate incremental reform versus abolitionist visions that seek to replace existing systems with entirely new models. These discussions can be contentious, but they reflect a willingness to imagine alternatives rather than accepting current arrangements as inevitable. Through all of this, the phrase Black Lives Matter retains its power as both affirmation and challenge. It asks listeners to consider why such a statement is necessary, what histories make it urgent, and what actions might make it less controversial in the future. The long struggle for racial justice is not linear. It advances, faces backlash, and advances again. Each wave leaves traces in law, culture, memory, and digital archives that shape the terrain for the next. Backlash has been a recurring feature of this history, and the era surrounding Black Lives Matter is no exception. After periods of visible protest and reform, counter-movements often arise, seeking to restore what they see as order or tradition. Following the gains of Reconstruction came Jim Crow. After the civil rights victories of the 1960s came political realignments that emphasized law and order, contributing to mass incarceration. In the 21st century, renewed attention to racial injustice has been met with efforts to restrict how race is discussed in schools, to frame diversity initiatives as suspect, and to portray protest as inherently destabilizing. These reactions are not separate from the movement's story. They are part of the dynamic through which social change unfolds. The language of law and order has particular resonance. It suggests neutrality and safety, yet historically it has often meant the preservation of existing hierarchies. When communities call attention to police violence, they are not rejecting safety, but questioning whose safety has been prioritized and at what cost. The debate exposes a fundamental tension. Is public order defined by the absence of visible disruption or by the presence of justice and trust? Black Lives Matter pushes the latter definition, arguing that peace without equity is fragile. Education has become a key arena for these disputes. School boards and state legislatures argue over how to teach the history of slavery, segregation, and ongoing inequality. For some, a frank account of racism is necessary for understanding the present. For others, such discussions are seen as divisive or accusatory. The outcome of these debates will influence how future generations interpret the events of this era. Just as earlier textbooks often minimized the brutality of slavery or the resistance of Black communities, today's curriculum choices will shape collective memory. Corporate responses illustrate another dimension of modern activism. Companies issued statements supporting racial justice, donated to related causes, and highlighted diversity initiatives. Yet critics questioned whether these gestures represented substantive change or branding. The relationship between capitalism and social movements has always been complex. Businesses can be sites of discrimination and also arenas where policy shifts, such as fair hiring practices, can have wide impact. The visibility of corporate engagement in the Black Lives Matter era reflects both the movement's reach and the risk that radical demands may be softened into market-friendly slogans. Technology companies, in particular, faced scrutiny. Their platforms helped mobilize protests and spread awareness, but they also hosted harassment, misinformation, and extremist content. Decisions about moderation, data privacy, and algorithm design had political consequences. Activists demanded greater transparency and responsibility, recognizing that digital spaces function as modern public squares even though they are privately owned. The psychological toll of sustained activism is another important aspect. Constant exposure to videos of violence and online debate can lead to trauma and burnout. Organizers speak about the need for rest, healing, and joy as forms of resistance. This emphasis connects to a broader understanding that the struggle for justice is not only about changing laws, but about sustaining communities and individual well-being. Practices such as art, music, spiritual reflection, and mutual support become part of the movement's infrastructure. Youth involvement stands out as well. Many protests have been led by high school and college students who grew up in a digital world and are accustomed to organizing online. They often bring an international perspective, linking racial justice in the United States to struggles elsewhere. Their participation suggests that the questions raised by Black Lives Matter will continue to shape public life for decades. At the same time, rural and small-town experiences add complexity. While media images often focus on large cities, issues of policing, poverty, and racial tension also affect smaller communities. Organizers in these areas may face different challenges, including fewer resources and more social isolation, but they contribute to a national network that is more geographically diverse than stereotypes might suggest. Faith in institutions remains a central theme. Surveys show varying levels of trust in police, courts, media, and government across racial lines. Black Lives Matter can be seen as both a symptom of eroded trust and an effort to rebuild it through accountability. The demand is not simply to criticize, but to transform institutions so that they serve all communities fairly. Throughout American history, moments of crisis have opened possibilities for change. The Great Depression reshaped economic policy. World War II accelerated civil rights claims as Black veterans returned, demanding equality. The COVID-19 pandemic similarly exposed inequalities in healthcare, employment, and housing, creating a context in which calls for racial justice resonated with broader concerns about vulnerability and state responsibility. The convergence of crises can make structural issues more visible, though it does not guarantee solutions. Storytelling itself is part of the movement's power. Personal narratives shared online or in public forums humanize statistics. A mother describing the loss of a son, a protester recounting an arrest, a nurse explaining disparities in patient outcomes. These voices create empathy and challenge abstraction. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and historians draw on this material, weaving individual experiences into broader analysis. In this way, the boundary between activism and historical record continues to blur. The long struggle for racial justice, seen through Black Lives Matter, is therefore not a single storyline, but an interwoven set of threads: law, economy, culture, memory, technology, and emotion. Each protest sign, court case, policy debate, and social media post becomes part of a vast, ongoing archive. Future historians will sift through tweets and live streams much as they once studied letters and newspapers, tracing how ordinary people responded to extraordinary circumstances. What remains constant is the insistence that Black lives have value in a society that has too often treated them as disposable. That insistence challenges not only overt prejudice, but the quieter habits of thought and policy that produce unequal outcomes. It calls for vigilance, imagination, and persistence. The movement's history, still unfolding, reminds us that justice is not a destination reached once and for all, but a process renewed by each generation, shaped by the tools at hand and the memories carried forward. One of the most striking features of this era is how quickly local events can enter national and even global consciousness. A traffic stop in a small city, a cell phone video recorded in a matter of seconds, a name shared across platforms, and suddenly a person who was unknown outside their neighborhood becomes a symbol in a worldwide conversation. This compression of time and space alters the tempo of activism. Organizers must respond rapidly, verify information, and channel emotion into sustained action rather than brief outrage. The speed of digital communication can create surges of attention that are difficult to maintain, yet those surges also open windows in which policy discussions that once seemed marginal become urgent. Legal scholars and policymakers have wrestled with how to translate moral energy into institutional reform. Proposals range from banning specific practices such as chokeholds to revising standards that determine when force is justified, to creating independent bodies that investigate police misconduct. Data collection has become a focal point, with advocates arguing that without accurate national records on use of force, traffic stops, and deaths in custody, patterns remain obscured. The demand for transparency reflects a broader democratic principle. Institutions that wield significant power should be subject to public scrutiny. At the same time, many activists emphasize that policing cannot be viewed in isolation from broader social policy. If mental health services are underfunded, police may become default responders to crises for which they are not trained. If affordable housing is scarce, homelessness becomes criminalized. If schools lack counselors and support staff, disciplinary issues may be routed through law enforcement. In this view, safety emerges not only from enforcement, but from investment in the conditions that allow people to thrive. This reframing challenges traditional budget priorities and invites communities to imagine different allocations of public resources. The courtroom is only one site where accountability is pursued. Civil lawsuits, consent decrees between federal authorities and local police departments, and grassroots oversight efforts all play roles. Body-worn cameras, once promoted as a technological solution, have produced mixed results. They can provide evidence, but their impact depends on policies governing when cameras are activated, who can access footage, and how violations are addressed. Technology alone does not guarantee justice. It operates within legal and cultural frameworks. The emotional resonance of the movement also shapes public rituals. Moments of silence, the reading of names, and the painting of street murals create shared experiences that bridge strangers. These practices echo memorial traditions across cultures while carrying specific political meaning. They assert that lives lost to violence will not be forgotten and that memory itself can be a form of resistance. Universities and research institutions have responded by expanding programs in race, inequality, and social justice. Scholars analyze data on policing, health disparities, environmental racism, and wealth gaps, providing empirical grounding for claims long made by activists. This interaction between scholarship and activism is not new, but digital communication accelerates the exchange. Research findings can circulate widely beyond academic journals, influencing public debate. the international dimension continues to evolve. In some countries, activists adapt the language of Black Lives Matter to address discrimination against Roma communities, migrants, indigenous peoples, or ethnic minorities with distinct histories. While contexts differ, the shared emphasis on dignity and accountability creates a sense of global dialogue. The movement thus participates in a longer tradition of transnational exchange, where ideas about rights and justice cross borders. Within families, conversations about race have taken on new urgency. Parents talk to children about how to interact with police, a practice long common in many Black households, but now more widely discussed. Workplaces hold trainings on bias and inclusion. These private and semi-private discussions, though less visible than marches, represent shifts in social norms and awareness. Yet fatigue can set in. News cycles move on, and sustained attention is difficult. Movements must balance urgency with endurance, finding ways to maintain engagement over years. This often means building local institutions, training new leaders, and celebrating incremental victories while keeping larger goals in view. The history of civil rights suggests that change often comes through a combination of dramatic moments and patient groundwork. The Black Lives Matter era underscores that history is not only something that happened in the past, but something being made in the present. The tools of documentation, smartphones, social media, digital archives, ensure that this history is recorded in unprecedented detail. At the same time, interpretation remains contested. Different groups tell different stories about the same events, emphasizing order or injustice, individual behavior, or systemic forces. The struggle over meaning is part of the struggle for power. In the end, the phrase that began as a social media post encapsulates centuries of experience. It carries the memory of slavery, segregation, and resistance, the voices of those who marched in Selma and those who live-stream protests today, the hope that institutions can change, and the realism that progress is often uneven. The long struggle for racial justice continues not as a straight line, but as a series of waves, each shaped by the conditions of its time. As new generations take up the call, they do so with both the weight of history and the possibilities of new tools, adding their own chapters to an ongoing narrative that challenges a nation to live up to its professed ideals. As the movement's language filters into everyday life, it reshapes how people interpret ordinary encounters. A traffic stop, a school disciplinary action, a job interview, these moments are increasingly viewed through an awareness that bias can operate subtly as well as overtly. This does not mean that every disparity has a single cause, but it encourages closer examination of patterns that once went unquestioned. Data journalism, community research projects, and public records requests have become tools for ordinary citizens, not just professionals, to analyze how power functions in their cities. The historical relationship between protest and patriotism also comes into focus. Critics sometimes frame racial justice movements as un-American, yet participants often argue the opposite, that demanding equal protection under the law is a fulfillment of the nation's founding promises. This tension has deep roots. Abolitionists, suffragists, labor organizers, and civil rights activists were all at times labeled disruptive or disloyal. Over time, many of their goals came to be seen as expansions of democracy. The debate over Black Lives Matter thus continues a long-standing argument about whether love of country means preserving existing structures or striving to perfect them. Veterans of earlier movements have noted the importance of narrative discipline, clarity about goals and messaging, while also acknowledging that decentralized networks resist simple summaries. In the Black Lives Matter era, a slogan can travel far beyond the intentions of those who first used it. People adopt it to express grief, solidarity, anger, or hope, sometimes without deep engagement in policy debates. This broad appeal is both strength and vulnerability. It builds a wide coalition, but leaves room for misunderstanding and co-optation. Local governance has proven to be a critical arena. While national politics draw attention, many decisions about policing, school funding, and housing are made at city or county levels. Activists have run for office, served on review boards, and participated in public budget hearings, translating protest energy into administrative processes. This shift from street to council chamber reflects a recognition that durable change often requires engagement with the slow mechanics of government. The criminal legal system's ripple effects extend beyond those directly involved. A single arrest can affect employment prospects, housing eligibility, and family stability. Communities with high rates of incarceration experience economic strain and social fragmentation. Black Lives Matter discourse often highlights these broader consequences, arguing that justice cannot be measured solely by crime statistics, but must consider long-term community well-being. Environmental justice has also intersected with the movement. Many predominantly black neighborhoods face higher exposure to pollution, limited green space, and vulnerability to climate-related disasters. These conditions influence health outcomes and quality of life. By connecting police violence to other forms of structural harm, activists present a holistic vision of what it means for lives to matter, not only freedom from violence, but access to clean air, safe water, and stable housing. The arts continue to document and interpret this period. Poets, filmmakers, and musicians create works that capture the emotional texture of protest, the tension of a crowd, the quiet of a vigil, the exhaustion after months of organizing. These cultural artifacts serve as historical sources, conveying aspects of experience that statistics alone cannot. They also offer spaces for reflection and healing, reminding participants of their shared humanity. Digital memory presents both opportunity and challenge. Posts and videos can be preserved indefinitely, creating a vast archive. Yet platforms change, accounts are deleted, and context can be lost. Historians of the future will face the task of interpreting this abundance, discerning which voices were amplified and which remained marginalized even online. The democratization of documentation does not automatically ensure equal visibility. As the immediate intensity of large protest waves subsides, quieter forms of change may continue. Training programs, revised policies, new community organizations, and shifts in public opinion accumulate gradually. Some reforms may be rolled back, others may endure. The long view of history suggests that progress is rarely linear. Gains can be fragile, requiring vigilance to maintain. Personal transformation is another dimension. Many individuals describe the period as a turning point in their understanding of race and justice. Friendships, family relationships, and workplace dynamics have been tested by difficult conversations. While conflict can be painful, it can also lead to deeper awareness. Social movements operate not only at the level of institutions, but within hearts and minds. The question of what safety truly means remains central. Is safety simply the absence of crime, or does it include freedom from fear of those sworn to protect? Does it require economic security, healthcare, and belonging? By broadening the definition, Black Lives Matter challenges narrow metrics and invites a reimagining of social priorities. Across centuries, Black communities have balanced resistance with creation, building schools, businesses, art, and traditions even in hostile conditions. The current movement stands in that lineage. Protest is one expression, but so is the daily work of teaching, caregiving, and community building. These quieter labors sustain life and make collective action possible. As history continues to unfold, new events will reshape the conversation. Yet the central insight, that the value of Black life has been systematically denied and must be affirmed, anchors the narrative. Each generation interprets that insight through its own circumstances, technologies, and political realities. The documentary record of this era, dense with images, words, and data, ensures that future observers will have a detailed window into how people grappled with enduring questions of justice, power, and human dignity. The endurance of the movement also depends on how it navigates internal differences. No broad coalition is entirely unified, and Black Lives Matter encompasses people with varied ideologies, tactics, and priorities. Some emphasize electoral engagement, others direct action, others community service or legal advocacy. Debates over strategy can be intense, yet they also reflect a living movement rather than a static one. Earlier struggles for racial justice were similarly marked by disagreements between those who favored litigation and those who favored mass protest, between advocates of integration and proponents of Black self-determination. These tensions, while challenging, often generated new ideas and approaches. Leadership models have shifted noticeably from the mid-20th century. The public memory of the civil rights era often centers on a few male figures, but that narrative has always been incomplete. Women, young people, and local organizers played critical roles. The Black Lives Matter generation has been more explicit in rejecting hierarchical leadership structures, instead highlighting collective leadership and the contributions of queer and trans activists. This reflects both ideological commitments and practical realities of organizing in networked digital spaces. The role of law enforcement officers themselves adds another layer. Some officers have expressed support for reform, acknowledging problems within policing culture. Others feel under siege, arguing that criticism undermines morale and recruitment. These perspectives coexist within institutions that are not monolithic. Efforts to change policing practices must therefore address culture, incentives, training, and accountability mechanisms, not only individual behavior. Rural-urban divides shape the conversation as well. In densely populated cities, police departments are large and interactions frequent. In rural areas, distances are greater, resources fewer, and personal relationships more intertwined. Yet issues of race, poverty, and state power appear in both contexts. Understanding these variations helps explain why national policy solutions can be difficult to implement uniformly. The legal concept of civil rights has expanded over time, but its enforcement depends on political will. Court decisions can set precedents, yet they may be narrowed or overturned. Federal oversight of local police departments can lead to reforms, but such oversight can also be withdrawn. This fluidity means that gains achieved during one political moment may require defense in the next. Activists therefore operate with an awareness of both opportunity and vulnerability. Cultural memory plays a subtle role. Images from past movements, marchers crossing bridges, fire hoses turned on children, sit-ins at lunch counters, form a visual archive that shapes expectations about what protest looks like. The images of the Black Lives Matter era, crowds filling highways, masked demonstrators during a pandemic, murals painted on asphalt, will in turn influence how future generations imagine civic action. Each era leaves behind symbols that carry emotional weight. Language itself evolves. Terms that once seemed radical can become mainstream, while new phrases emerge to capture changing realities. The conversation about race is dynamic, influenced by scholarship, activism, and lived experience. Disagreements over terminology often signal deeper debates about goals and analysis. Internationally, the movement contributes to a broader reckoning with histories of slavery, colonialism, and discrimination. Museums reassess exhibits, universities examine ties to slave labor, and governments confront legacies of empire. While these processes unfold differently in each country, they share an impulse to connect past injustices with present inequalities. Technology continues to reshape possibilities. New platforms arise, old ones decline, and activists adapt. Encrypted messaging, crowdfunding, and online teach-ins expand the toolkit. At the same time, digital surveillance and harassment present risks. The balance between visibility and security is an ongoing concern. The human desire for dignity underlies these developments. Statistics and policies matter, but so does the simple demand to be seen and valued. When protesters chant names, they resist the reduction of lives to numbers. When families speak about loved ones lost, they insist on individuality and memory. The long struggle for racial justice, viewed through the lens of Black Lives Matter, reveals a society continually negotiating the meaning of equality. Laws change, technologies evolve, and demographics shift, yet the fundamental question, how to create a community in which all members can live without fear and with genuine opportunity, remains. Each wave of activism adds new layers to this conversation, drawing on history while forging new paths. The story does not resolve neatly. There are victories and setbacks, moments of solidarity and moments of division. But the persistence of the movement across years suggests that the issues it raises are deeply rooted. As long as disparities in safety, wealth, health, and political power align along racial lines, the call that Black Lives Matter will continue to resonate, echoing past struggles and shaping those yet to come. At the heart of this continuing story is the question of how societies change at all. History shows that transformation rarely comes solely from within institutions or solely from outside pressure. It emerges from the interaction between people in the streets, advocates in courtrooms, officials inside government, and storytellers shaping public understanding. Black Lives Matter operates across all these arenas, sometimes in tension, sometimes in coordination. A protest may draw attention, a lawsuit may set precedent, a city council vote may redirect funds, and a film or novel may shift how millions of people imagine the problem. One reason the movement has had such lasting influence is that it links immediate incidents to deep historical patterns. When a video of police violence circulates, it is not interpreted in isolation, but against a backdrop of centuries in which Black mobility, labor, and presence have been regulated by force. This historical consciousness does not arise automatically. It is taught through families, schools, books, and community conversations. The digital age accelerates this process, allowing archival materials, speeches, and historical analysis to circulate alongside breaking news. The past becomes a lens for reading the present in real time. Demographic change in the United States also shapes the context. The country is more racially and ethnically diverse than in earlier eras, and younger generations tend to express more comfort with that diversity. This does not eliminate prejudice, but it influences the political landscape in which racial justice claims are made. Coalitions can form across racial and ethnic lines, especially around shared experiences of economic precarity or encounters with the criminal legal system. The workplace is another site of evolution. Employees organize discussions, affinity groups, and pressure campaigns that push employers to address discrimination and representation. Professional associations in fields from medicine to technology examine how bias affects outcomes. These developments extend the movement's reach into everyday institutional life, beyond moments of crisis. Faith traditions continue to provide language and structure for many participants. Sermons, prayer circles, and interfaith coalitions frame racial justice as a moral imperative. At the same time, secular ethics rooted in human rights discourse offer parallel justifications. This blending of moral vocabularies allows the movement to resonate with people of varied beliefs. A key challenge is sustaining attention without constant tragedy. When no single incident dominates headlines, the underlying issues can seem less urgent to those not directly affected. Organizers respond by highlighting ongoing disparities, publishing reports, and marking anniversaries that keep memory alive. Commemoration becomes a strategy, ensuring that names and stories do not fade. The role of local knowledge is crucial. National narratives can overlook specific community dynamics, relationships between residents and particular police departments, histories of migration, economic shifts tied to factory closures or gentrification. Effective activism often depends on understanding these details. National networks provide resources and visibility, but local organizers translate broad principles into context-specific action. Over time, some reforms become normalized. Practices once controversial, such as publishing data on police stops or establishing civilian review boards, may enter mainstream governance. Other proposals remain contested. The line between radical and reasonable shifts as public opinion evolves. This fluid boundary is part of how social movements reshape what is considered possible. The emotional landscape of the movement is complex. Anger at injustice coexists with love for community, pride in cultural heritage, and moments of joy even amid struggle. Celebrations of Black art, history, and achievement remind participants that the movement is not only about confronting harm, but about affirming life and creativity. Global crises, economic downturns, pandemics, climate disasters intersect with racial inequality, often magnifying it. These intersections reinforce the idea that justice is interconnected. Efforts to address one form of vulnerability may influence others. The Black Lives Matter era thus unfolds within a broader web of global challenges. As the years pass, children who saw protests on television or accompanied parents to marches grow into adults with memories shaped by this period. Their sense of what civic engagement looks like will be informed by images of crowds, hashtags, and community meetings. Just as earlier generations were shaped by memories of the civil rights movement, this generation carries its own formative experiences. Ultimately, the long struggle for racial justice is a story about expanding the circle of those whose lives are protected, valued, and heard. Black Lives Matter articulates that expansion in direct, urgent language. It insists that the measure of a society lies in how it treats those historically pushed to the margins. The movement's ongoing presence in streets, courts, classrooms, workplaces, and digital spaces testifies to both the depth of the problem and the resilience of those determined to address it. History offers no guarantee of outcomes, but it does show that persistent collective action can alter laws, norms, and expectations. The narrative unfolding now will join the layers of memory that future generations inherit. They will look back on this era's debates, images, and decisions to understand how their world was shaped. In that sense, the story being lived today is already becoming history, recorded not only in official documents, but in countless voices insisting, again and again, on the value of Black lives.